The snow had a way of muting the world. It softened even cruelty, disguising it under clean white layers. But it did not stop for her, not when the train hissed and rolled away, nor when the station master pulled his coat tighter and stepped back into the warmth, not offering even a glance. Iris Whitlow stood alone on the wooden platform, the hem of her dress stiff with frost, hands tucked beneath her arms for heat. Her suitcase sat beside her like a tombstone, leather cracked, the buckle bent as if life had been trying to escape from it too. She had arrived 2 hours ago. Or maybe 3. The snow made time irrelevant. The white drifted and settled on her shoulders like quiet mockery, each flake a whisper from the town that had already turned its back. She hadn't eaten in a day. Her last coin had bought the ticket from Kansas City to this nowhere place with its one-lane Main Street, crooked church steeple, and absence of any man claiming her as his bride. He was supposed to meet her. Josiah Cutter. That was his name. And he didn't. The station master peeked out again, tapping the frosted glass. "Ma'am, you can't stay here all night." She didn't answer. Didn't have the strength to explain that she had nowhere else. That the man who promised her warmth had learned she was barren through church gossip and cancelled her womb like a train ticket. No man in the West wanted a woman who couldn't bear fruit. Not even in a country dying for women. She moved toward the bench and sat, the wood sharp and frozen beneath her. Her hands trembled inside her shawl. She tucked her fingers under her sleeves and tried to still her teeth. Above her, the sky faded from pewter to charcoal, and the snow kept falling like God had turned his face and left the weather to grieve on its own. The town beyond the station didn't notice her. Windows glowed orange behind frostbitten glass. Boots clicked on wood floors behind saloon doors. Laughter lived, somewhere, in a place she had no name for. It wasn't just cold. It was forgetting. A kind of vanishing. She was a preacher's daughter once. She had dreams once. Now, she was a figure wrapped in threadbare wool with a suitcase full of false promises and underthings stitched with hope that some man might find her woman enough. A dog barked distantly. Then silence. And then she saw him. The wind shifted. The snow stilled as if in reverence. A figure strode out from the tree line behind the station, slow, deliberate, larger than life. No horse. No sound but the soft crunch of his boots in the snow. He was tall. Giant, really. Apache by the long black braid in copper skin. Wrapped in buffalo hide that steamed with the heat of his walk. No hat. Bare chest under open cloak. His eyes were coal dark, and they didn't dart like settler men's did when they were deciding whether a woman was worth saving. They just saw her. Iris didn't move. She watched him, not in fear, but in stillness. She had seen men look at her before. Hungry or dismissive or cold. But never like this. He stopped a few feet from her bench. Looked down at her with the silence of old trees. He looked not at her shame or her weakness, but at her existence. She couldn't speak. His gaze dropped to her suitcase, then back to her eyes. Then, he reached down with one massive hand and picked it up, not like a thing he was taking, but something he was lifting from the ground out of mercy. Then he spoke. "You're coming with me." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was low, grounded, like thunder that had no interest in rain. Just presence. Authority wrapped in kindness so quiet, it felt holy. She should have refused. Should have asked why or who he was or what he meant. But something in her had already made the choice before the question. She stood. Her knees ached. Her fingers burned from returning blood. But she followed. No one stopped her. They walked past the silent station. Past the lamplight flickering near the telegraph pole. She followed him into the trees, snow thickening around their boots, silence growing deeper. And still, not a word passed between them. Only once, after they crossed a shallow frozen creek, did she speak not to him, but to herself. "I don't even know your name." He didn't stop walking. But his voice came like a drum in the snow. "Wakana." She said nothing else. That was enough. When they reached his home, set high in the woods, tucked in stone and shadow, the fire inside had already burned long. The cabin smelled of pine, leather, and something roasted. He opened the door for her. She stepped inside, shivering still. It was not the heat that stunned her. It was the dignity. A table stood in the corner. Clean. A single bowl rested on it, as if waiting. A carved wooden hawk perched on the shelf above the fire. The rug was tattered but swept. There were blankets folded on a cot, as though a guest might one day come. He placed her suitcase down gently, then stepped back out. No demands. No explanation. She didn't remove her coat. Didn't sit. She simply stood there, clutching herself, waiting for the other shoe to fall. For the price to be named. But it never came. When he returned, he handed her a bowl of stew. Hot. Simple. She took it in shaking hands, nodded, and sat near the fire. He sat across from her. They didn't speak again that night. She slept near the hearth, wrapped in hides. He sat on a chair near the door, arms crossed, eyes half closed, but always watching. When morning came, the snow had covered everything. Even the path back to town. She opened the door and looked out, not to escape, but to see if the world still existed. The world did. But for the first time in months, it didn't seem to be looking back with disgust. She turned to see Wakana by the fire, stirring something in a pot. He didn't glance up. But he said, "Stay if you want." And she did. She did. And far above them, in that pale, snow-quiet sky, the sun tried to break through. Just barely. But it tried. The second morning arrived with silence so pure it felt like music. Iris sat near the fire again, her fingers cupped around a tin mug filled with something strong and bitter. Wakana had handed it to her without a word, same as last night's stew, same as the fur blanket that appeared beside her when she'd begun to shiver in her sleep. He moved through the small cabin with the grace of a man who needed nothing from the world and expected even less from those in it. She watched him work in the half-light of dawn, saw the way he set logs beside the hearth, how his shoulders curved not from weakness but from a kind of gentle strength. He didn't fill the space with questions. He didn't ask where she was from or what had brought her here. His eyes held no pity, just a steady knowing, like he had already heard a version of her story many times before and found no reason to ask for another. Outside, snow whispered down in flakes the size of buttons, coating the trees until they looked like sculptures from a forgotten world. The landscape was white and blank, like a clean page. But inside, warmth grew not just from firewood, but from something subtler, something softer. Iris still didn't know why he'd brought her. She had no coin. No kin. No worth, according to the town's measure. A barren woman wasn't a wife. Wasn't even a future. Yet Wakana had looked at her, lifted her suitcase, and chosen. It unnerved her as much as it comforted her. The day passed slowly. She helped in small ways, brushed snow from the cabin's stoop, stacked kindling, peeled potatoes with the blade he left resting beside the cutting board. He didn't direct her. He simply let her move, let her return to herself one small task at a time. Later, she found a series of carvings on the shelf beside his bedroll, figures shaped from pine and birch. A hawk mid-flight. A woman with a long braid. A child curled in sleep. They weren't polished or perfect, but each one breathed. She touched the edge of the woman's cloak, felt the grooves beneath her thumb. "You carve these?" she asked, her voice low from disuse. Wakana nodded once. No smile. Just truth. "They're beautiful," she murmured. He said nothing, but the silence between them thickened richer somehow, not empty but alive. By the third day, Iris knew the shape of his movements. The way he laced his moccasins without looking down. How he tested the logs for dryness by scent. How he always sat beside the door at night, his knife across his knee, not for show, but readiness. There was protection in him, yes, but not dominance. He didn't try to own her pain or erase it. He just made room for it to breathe. That evening, she ventured a question. "Why did you take me?" He looked up from the fire, then slowly set down the ladle. He didn't speak for a long time. The wind outside rustled the pine branches, tapping against the window in slow rhythm. Then finally, he said, "Because you were not meant to be left." Just that. 7 words, and they knocked something loose inside her. A dam that had been holding back tears without knowing it. She looked down into her lap, unable to meet his eyes. Her whole life had been the slow burn of being left by her mother, by the preacher's congregation when she confessed she could not conceive, by Josiah on the day she was supposed to become someone's wife. Wakana didn't know any of that. Or maybe he did. That night, she found an extra hide folded near the fire. Beneath it, a carving she hadn't seen before. It was a small figure of a woman sitting with her knees drawn up, a blanket draped over her shoulders. He had carved the face simply, but with tenderness. Her posture looked like rest. She didn't say anything, but she slept with it beside her that night. On the 4th morning, she rose before him. She stepped outside barefoot just long enough to feel the snow between her toes, just to know she still could. The cold bit quick and fierce, and she laughed. Actually laughed. It startled the birds. When she came back in, Wakana was awake, watching her with eyes that betrayed nothing. But his lips turned slightly, not a smile exactly, but a shift. Unknowing. She began to cook with him after that. He showed her by gesture, by repetition. They shared space like 2 quiet wolves who had learned not to fear proximity. Their silences were no longer heavy. They became shelter. But still, no one came looking for her. And the town, it seemed, had forgotten her just as quickly as Josiah had. Forgotten or chosen to erase her. The snow had a way of covering mistakes, and Iris had been considered one. On the 6th day, Wakana brought home a leather pouch filled with thread and beads. He handed it to her after supper and nodded once. "For you," he said. Iris opened it gently, hands shaking. "To mend what's broken." Wakana looked at her and said, "To make what you want." And somehow, that was the first time she felt like her body belonged to her again. Her life, too. They didn't speak of the future. Didn't need to. But she began to hum when she swept the floor. Began to braid her hair in the mornings. And once, while drying her hands after chopping wood, she touched the side of Wakana's hand. Just barely. He didn't flinch. He just let it happen. Later that night, she watched him sit at the edge of the bedroll, carving again. This time, it was 2 hawks, wings open, facing the same direction. She didn't ask who they were for. She already knew. She dreamed of snow that night, not cruel, not blank, but glowing under moonlight like something reborn. And in the dream, Wakana stood beside her, saying nothing, but watching as she placed her bare hands in the cold earth and pulled something green and living up from beneath it. When she woke, the storm had started again, fat flakes falling hard against the glass. But she didn't fear it anymore. Snow might still fall. But it would not stop her. Not now. And not here. By the 7th day, Iris no longer hesitated before touching things in Wakana's cabin. Her hand found the door latch easily. She stirred the stew without asking. She swept pine needles from the entryway and began humming again, not for performance, but because it filled the air between silence and memory. The home did not become hers, but it stopped feeling borrowed. That was its own kind of miracle. Wakana still spoke little. His voice remained rare as thunder on a windless plain. But in its place came small gestures, the extra strip of deer hide left by her bedside, the cedar oil rubbed into her cracked palms, the way he moved aside whenever she passed, though there was plenty of space. Respect in stillness. That's what it was. The fire in the cabin became a third presence. Always burning, always watching. It listened without judgment. It didn't ask for her history, didn't shame her for staying. It licked the edges of the room in orange and gold, warming the shadows she hadn't known she'd brought with her. She sat before it often, knees tucked up, eyes open long past nightfall. Wakana would sit across from her, sometimes carving, sometimes sharpening a blade, sometimes simply existing. She never told him her name. Not because she didn't want to, but because he hadn't asked. And strangely, she liked that. There was power in not being defined by the letters people had said with disappointment for years. Iris. The girl who couldn't bear children. Iris, the empty well. The useless daughter. The broken bride. Wakana saw her without those echoes. One evening, when the sky turned the color of lavender smoke, Iris stepped outside. The snow had lightened, falling in slow spirals like a curtain being drawn back from heaven. She looked out over the ridge and saw the town far below, lamplight twinkling in orderly rows, small and cold from this height. She hadn't been back since the station. She didn't want to. But she knew what they were saying. Martha Green's tongue worked faster than any church bell. A settler woman gone missing. Some said she ran off in shame. Others whispered she was taken by an Apache and kept like a stray dog. None knew the truth, and none cared to. Iris did not miss their names. She only missed feeling known. When she returned inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, Wakana was placing something new on the mantel above the fire, a small wooden figure of a bird mid-flight. She paused beside him, studying the lines of the carving. Its wings were wide, but not perfect. One had a chip on the edge. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. He nodded once. Wind broke the wing. She tilted her head. "Then why carve it mid-flight?" Wakana's eyes met hers. "Still flies." Her breath caught. There it was. The truth between them, delivered without fanfare. She looked back at the fire, its steady crackle now feeling more like applause than noise. That night, she offered him a story not spoken, but shown. She unwrapped her hands from her sleeves and rolled them over. The scars on her wrists were not deep, but they told everything. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply reached forward and placed one of his hands over hers, calloused, warm, sure. She didn't cry. She just breathed for the first time in years without apology. The next day, she asked to go into town. Wakana said nothing for a long time. Then nodded. He packed her a piece of bread, laced his boots, and walked beside her the entire 3 miles down. They arrived as the morning frost was lifting. The church bell had not yet rung, and only a few townsfolk milled about, men hauling barrels, women wringing their shawls tighter. But the moment Iris stepped onto the main street, everything slowed. Heads turned. Whispers rose like steam. Josiah Cutter was there. She spotted him standing beside the general store, holding a coil of rope he didn't need. His eyes locked on her, and she felt the air tighten. He was paler than she remembered. Shorter, too. The illusion of his power had died the moment he'd left her in the snow. She walked past him without pause. Wakana remained by her side, silent, unmoved. Inside the mercantile, the owner's wife refused to meet Iris's eyes. Her mouth twitched as she folded fabric and turned away. But Iris paid no mind. She chose a spool of thread, a new needle, and a bar of soap. Things meant for building, not begging. On the way out, a boy no older than 7 stepped in front of her and asked, "Are you his wife?" Iris looked down at him, then up at Wakana. She smiled. Not yet. The words felt like sunlight on her tongue. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had begun to dip behind the ridge. Iris built the fire herself that evening, stacking the logs with care, feeding them in rhythm. Wakana sat beside her and watched. No correction. No interference. Only trust. As the flames grew, she spoke not to him directly, but to the room itself. "My father used to say that a woman was the vessel of the Lord's purpose," she said, eyes locked on the blaze. "He stopped saying it when the doctor told me I couldn't carry children." Wakana didn't reply, but the air between them shifted. He reached up and placed something in her lap. It was one of his carvings, a small, seated figure. A woman holding something in her lap. It wasn't a child. It was firewood. Useful. Gentle. Sacred. Iris traced the edges with trembling fingers. She still hadn't told him her name. But when she looked across the fire and saw the reflection of his eyes in the flame, She understood he already knew who she was, who she'd always been before the world had narrowed her worth to womb and silence. And suddenly, the fire no longer felt like it was simply burning. It felt like it was listening. Like it had always known she would come. Like it didn't need her name to see her. Outside, the snow began again, quiet, steady, as if giving her one more chance to start over. And this time, she would not miss it. The day Iris wore her boots into town without asking permission, the air felt sharper than usual, like the sky itself was waiting to judge. The snow had melted just enough to expose the roads again, slushy, cracked earth framed by patches of frozen grass and wary eyes. She tied her hair back with a strip of old fabric and buttoned the top of her coat high against her throat, though it wasn't just the wind she was guarding against. Wakana waited by the door, already laced in moccasins and draped in his buffalo cloak. He said nothing as she stepped out beside him. He never did, not about this. But his presence alone steadied her heartbeat. They walked shoulder to shoulder down the ridge, snow crunching underfoot, the town growing closer with every quiet breath. By the time they reached the first wooden buildings, weather-beaten fronts and warped porches, the town had already begun to turn toward them. Not openly. Not in greeting. Just a shift. Curtains drawn back. Doors cracked. Eyes narrowing from behind polished glass. They were not surprised to see her alive. They were annoyed. Because the dead don't return to correct the stories told about them. Old Martha Green was the first to speak, her voice a sharp hiss escaping from under her quilted shawl. "Is that the Whitlow girl?" "Lord above." Iris didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She felt Wakana's quiet presence at her side and let the heat of his nearness fortify her spine. But her ears caught it all. The whispers weren't new, they were just louder now that she stood upright, head held in defiance of the narrative they'd wrapped around her absence like burial cloth. Ran off with a savage. Her preacher father must be weeping. She's wearing his coat like she's earned it. She crossed the street, boots splashing in half-frozen puddles. She didn't look down. Let them watch. Let them burn on the inside. She had known their cruelty when it was quieter, when it wore perfume and smiled with thin lips and tighter corsets. That had been worse. She paused outside the church. Not because she meant to enter, but because the bell above the steeple was chiming, and it sounded strangely like mockery. A sound once sacred now echoed hollow. "Let's go in," she said quietly. Wakana didn't move at first. Then he nodded, stepping up beside her, pushing the door open with one broad hand. Inside, the scent of pine oil and dust pressed heavy in the air. Wooden pews sat half-filled, every head turning in unison like wind-blown wheat. The preacher paused mid-hymn, his hands frozen above the page. Josiah Cutter sat in the third row, clean-shaven and nervous, as if he knew something poisonous was about to bloom. Iris walked forward. Her footsteps were deliberate, steady. She took a seat in the last row, back straight, hands folded. Wakana stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the room. Whispers resumed the moment the hymn resumed. She couldn't hear the words anymore. She only heard herself, her heartbeat, her breath, the pulse of her own refusal to leave. She had been made a ghost in this town. But she had not died. And now, sitting where once she'd been a child in a flowered dress, reciting psalms with hope in her chest, she felt the last layers of shame begin to burn off like morning mist. After the final hymn, she stood. She didn't speak. Not to the preacher, not to the town. She simply turned, walked past the rows of cold faces, and stepped back into the light. Outside, the snow had started again. Gentle now. Like forgiveness. But just as they reached the mercantile steps, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "You ain't got no place here." Iris turned slowly. It was Josiah. He stood behind her, boots planted in slush, jaw tight. "You were supposed to marry me," he said, too loud, eyes flicking to the gathering crowd. "You never said you were broken." Wakana's shoulders rose slightly. He stepped forward. Iris reached out and stopped him with a hand on his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him first in front of anyone. "I wasn't broken," she said, her voice calm, too calm. You just wanted a body to plant seed in. Not a heart. Not a life. Josiah's face flushed. You've become a disgrace. No, she said, voice steady. You left me in the snow. And someone else picked me up and didn't ask me to be anything more than warm. Martha gasped from the crowd. Someone dropped a bag of flour. Wakana stepped beside Iris now, placing himself fully in the light. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Iris turned to Josiah, her eyes bright with something that almost looked like peace. You never asked me what I wanted, she said. But he did. Without speaking. She took Wakana's hand. Not to prove a point. But because it felt right. Then she looked at the crowd. At the stiff collars, the folded arms, the judgment that had weighed on her shoulders for years like a stone cross. I lived through your silence, she said. Now you'll live with mine. With that, she turned and walked away. Not hurried. Not afraid. Beside Wakana, her steps felt even. Balanced. She didn't speak again until they reached the edge of town, the snow now falling in heavy, wet flakes. Wakana finally broke the silence. They hate what they don't own. She looked up at him, breath fogging in the air. And I love what doesn't ask me to be anything else. He didn't respond. He just squeezed her hand once so gently she nearly missed it. When they reached the cabin, the fire had gone low, but it was still alive. She knelt beside it, fed its cedar bark and breath. The flames returned slowly. Like her. Like something the town could not extinguish. The storm came without warning. Not like the quiet snowfalls Iris had grown used to, but loud, wild, angry wind howling down from the mountains like some ancient, grieving god. It rattled the cabin's shutters. It bent the tall pines until they creaked like bones under pressure. And yet inside, Iris stirred stew with calm hands, her sleeves rolled, hair loosely tied, a hawk feather tucked behind one ear. Wakana stood at the window, arms crossed, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. He hadn't said much that day, but something in his stance was different. Guarded. As if the storm outside wasn't the one troubling him. It wasn't until just after dusk that they heard the noise, sharp, human, out of rhythm with the wind. A crunch of boots in snow. Then another. Then voices. Wakana moved quickly, grabbing his long knife from the wall and stepping toward the door. Iris stood, heart suddenly taut in her chest. Who is it? He didn't answer. She followed behind him anyway. The door creaked open and the storm roared in, snow lashing sideways. 3 boys stood at the edge of the path, all no older than 20. One held a club. Another had something wrapped in canvas, likely a rock or brick. The third just stared, eyes glassy, jaw tight. Behind them, barely visible in the wind-blown flurry, stood Josiah Cutter. Iris stepped out beside Wakana. The snow struck her cheeks like knives, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes met Josiah's. He didn't move closer. The boy with the club spat into the snow. Town don't want you here. Not him. Not her. Not this mix of things. Wakana didn't move. Iris did. She stepped forward, boots crunching through the ice, her voice clearer than she knew it could be. You left me in that snow, she said to Josiah. You thought I'd die out here. Josiah didn't speak. The boy with the brick laughed bitterly. We came to make sure it ends the way it should have. Iris's heart pounded in her ears, but her voice didn't shake. Then take your swing. But you'll have to look me in the eyes when you do. The boy faltered. The club lowered. Wakana didn't raise his knife. He didn't need to. Iris's stillness was louder than rage. And Josiah? He turned his back. Walked away. The other boys looked to each other, uncertain, their hate no longer held together by anyone's spine. One dropped the rock. Another simply vanished into the trees. Iris exhaled. Long, slow. Wakana stepped beside her. His hand brushed her back. And just like that, the wind began to die. It didn't stop all at once, but the anger of the storm loosened, like something had been heard. Or answered. Back inside, she sat by the fire with her knees drawn up. Wakana placed the kettle over the flame, and the warmth returned slowly, scent of cedar, sound of steam, safety curling into the room again. Iris didn't speak for a long time. When she did, it was with the weight of someone naming herself. My name is Iris. Wakana looked up from the kettle. Not surprised. Not eager. Just ready. He nodded once. I know. She smiled faintly. I wanted you to hear it from me. Outside, the storm rolled east. Quieted. The next morning, the air was clear. Sky blue as pressed linen. Trees heavy with snow but still. They buried the firewood deeper in the shed. Wakana showed her how to bind the roof against spring leaks. They worked in quiet rhythm. Trust not spoken but known. Later that week, she returned to town. Not with fear, but with fabric folded under one arm and wildflowers braided into her braid. She walked alone this time. Wakana stayed behind not because she asked him to, but because she didn't need him to stand between her and the world anymore. At the mercantile, no one spoke. But no one turned her away. She bought flour, salt, and sugar with coins she'd sewn into her boot months ago. On the way back, she passed Martha Green, who turned her face toward the sky and said nothing. That was enough. When Iris reached the ridge again, the cabin stood warm and waiting. Wakana carved beside the fire. This time, he was shaping two hands, one open, one resting inside it. Not clutched. Not gripped. Just resting. She sat beside him. Took a breath. Then rested her hand on his knee. No words. Just that. And far below, the town lay small and quiet. The storm had bowed and gone. And in its place, something new had been born, not with fire, but through it. Love, perhaps. Or something more resilient. Something earned. And the fire, as always, did not ask her name. It only burned steady. Kept them warm. Held their silence like scripture. And maybe that was enough.